Hi, welcome to another exciting episode of the Andre the Beast Grading Show. Another exciting show, definitely another exciting guest. And I got my PJs on today because I'm going to call it the Storybook Podcast today. So I'm going to sit back and we're gonna share some knowledge from two cultures here. A black culture and a white culture. But let's go a little bit deeper. Let's talk about how this even came to be when we talk about two particular things: black, white, Native American, Latinos. How did all this even come to be? Today on the show, we had him on our show before, Mr. Scott Bennett. And this man has been setting the social media platforms on fire with so much information. And let me tell you what I mean by information. Information that if you are curious, you're going to be like, wow. And then it keeps opening up, let me use this word, rabbit holes for people. I'm a type of person, I like to jump in the holes. I like to see where they go to. So without further ado, let's welcome to the show, Mr. Scott Bennett. What's up, Scott?
Andre, so thank you so much for having me back on your show. I had such a great time last time we chatted, and I'm so happy you had me back. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
You know, this is how you came back this time. We talked about a particular topic called Baker's Rebellion.
Bacon's, yeah.
Bacon's Rebellion, not Baker, Bacon Rebellion. Yeah, forgive me for that. And it was funny because I thought I was alone in my information about it because very few people knew of it. And when you came on the show, we talked and I was like, okay, what do you know about this? And it just amazes me how a lot of people have never heard of it, don't know how it came to be. And just Scott was telling you earlier, Scott, we just had somebody on the show and it was like, I've never heard of that, but I often wonder how our classification came to be. Well, today we're going to talk about that with Scott. So, Scott, before we get started, tell the viewers a little bit about you before we get into the book.
Yeah, I have a Substack called Let's Make Them Pay, and that's my main channel for putting out my essays and my posts. I also have a TikTok channel, Let's Make Them Pay, an Instagram channel, Let's Make Them Pay Book, and I'm on YouTube as well. But I usually, I like to hit as many channels as I can. But
Right.
I'm all about the intersection of politics, economics, and history. And there's a lot to chew on there. And the one thing I really like to do is pass class consciousness onto people, which is what we call the awareness of you got the owning class, the people who own everything, and then you got the working class. And that's people like us who do all the work. And that is the fundamental power imbalance in our world right now. And one thing we need to do is empower the working class. That's what I think.
It's so funny that you said that because I just got off the phone talking to my co-host, Yolanda M. Smith, and she was talking about the gas prices. And she's like, I may not even drive no more. I said, well, this is my take on that. And to piggyback off of what you said, the two classes. I said, Yolanda, there's two type of people in the world: the rich and the poor. Now, the rich don't give a fuck about the gas prices.
That's right.
It's the poor and the middle class that care about the gas prices. But at the end of the day, the middle class can talk about it, but they're not going to be as harmed as much as the poor. So let's put it on a bigger scale. At the end of the day, you're going to still have to go to work. You're going to still have to put food on the table, and you're not going to protest because it's going to fall on deaf ears until it's time for an election. Then all of a sudden, the powers that be come down and promise you the world. But at the end of the day, that's called the game of life. And unless you have the money and power you're part of playing the game system and watching life unfold to its fullest.
Yeah, I mean that's the power balance now. But so many workers, we live after 100 years of labor suppression and uh, union busting,
Right.
and the rich class doing everything they could to separate the working class, divide and conquer. Right, and that's what we're talking about today with race. Is this is one of the earliest levers that was used. Well, there was one before that, which was men against women,
Right.
and making, dividing men from women. But then you go further and you divide white folks from people of color, and
Mhm.
you just find different ways to divide the working class so that
Right.
we are not focused on our power on unifying, because they have the money. It's true. The rich people have the money, but we also have power. And that's the power to withhold our labor and
Mhm.
to unify together, to get things that we need.
Scott, what drew your interest to this particular consciousness that you've developed and you're trying to pass on?
It was a long road for me. It started back during the George W. Bush administration. I remember when he was talking about weapons of mass destruction, and I didn't believe that that was real. I thought that was a lie to get us into that war. I thought that war was going to be was being fought for different reasons than they were telling us. And when I felt that way, I started reading more and looking for other people who felt that way. And some of them that felt that one particular that felt that way was a man named Michael Parenti, and he was my favorite teacher. And you can find many speeches and books by Michael Parenti, speeches on YouTube. You can find speeches on something called TUC Radio. And he was a very dynamic and powerful speaker, a historian, who helped me develop my class consciousness, because he was talking about all this history that I didn't know about. And there was one other person, and that was Howard Zinn. And he's the one who we were going to talk about today. This book, A People's History of the United States, is a very famous book. Howard Zinn also helped me develop that class consciousness by um, providing a lot of the history that we don't hear. You don't get this kind of history on the History Channel
Right.
or in your textbooks at school. This is the kind of history that the powerful don't want us to know,
Mhm.
because it's a history of people who are apparently powerless,
Mhm.
people like slaves, people like factory workers 100 years ago, people
Mhm.
who, you wouldn't look at them and say that they have power, but when they get together, they can really scare the owning class.
And a lot of people don't realize this. There's 100% truth in what you just said. Because let's look at some of the old time pictures, and then we're gonna get into the book. Let's look at some of the old time pictures, such as Pinky Blinders. When
Hmm.
everybody came to this country, they started to find their niche after such events as Bacon's rebellion and in the different revolutions that we had. We still noticed that people still had somewhat of a conscience of self to say we need to stick together, and together we can really change. And we saw that happen with certain cultures in this country, and then somehow or another, I can't tell you what happened. Maybe it was the fact that maybe getting resources from our government to detain rebellion seemed to be the way to go. But let's go back to the book in general. When you was introduced to this book, what went through your mind, because you didn't know anything about Bacon Rebellion?
Yeah, it's Bacon's rebellion was one of the reasons why we got the U.S. Constitution, because Bacon's rebellion happened during the period of what was the Articles of Confederation. So it was after the after independence from England, but before we had a constitution. And the owning class basically panicked, and they were like, we don't have enough power to suppress rebellions under the current Articles of Confederation. Power was too dispersed, and so they needed to centralize power. And so it was Bacon's Rebellion. The important thing about Bacon's Rebellion is it was white folks and black folks all joining together because they were upset about, as I'm talking about this, I wish I had known a little bit. I wish I had known I was going to be talking more about Bacon's Rebellion, because I would have studied up a little bit on it, because as I'm talking about this, I'm not 100% right that I'm about the dates when I'm talking about, and that would be really embarrassing if I was wrong. Hold on one second. Let me just look up this date real quick in here. Let's see here.
But even as you're looking that up, people need to realize too, you said something that was very crucial here, that white people and black people and other civilizations got along. And even not saying there wasn't slavery during that time, but it was a different type of slavery than what you was told with history, because everybody, if you was poor and you was white, you got treated just as the black person did that was considered a slave, or the same punishment was rendered throughout everybody there. Did you find the date?
I did. It was 1741. So I was wrong about that, about the Articles of Confederation. Forget I said all of that part. But here, I could just read this little bit here to give you an idea about what we're talking about here. In New York, 1741, there were 10,000 whites in the city and 2,000 black slaves. It had been a hard winter, and the poor, slave and free, had suffered greatly. When mysterious fires broke out, blacks and whites were accused of conspiring together. Mass hysteria developed against the accused. After a trial full of lurid accusations by informers and forced confessions, 2 white men and 2 white women were executed. 18 slaves were hanged, and 13 slaves were burned alive. Only one fear was greater than the fear of black rebellion in the new American colonies. That was the fear that discontented whites would join black slaves to overthrow the existing order. In the early years of slavery, especially before racism as a way of thinking was firmly ingrained, while white indentured servants were often treated as badly as black slaves, there was a possibility of cooperation. And I'll just read this one more little passage here. As Edmund Morgan sees it, there are hints that the 2 despised groups initially saw each other as sharing the same predicament. It was common, for example, for servants and slaves to run away together, steal hogs together, get drunk together. It was not uncommon for them to make love together. In Bacon's Rebellion, one of the last groups to surrender was a mixed band of 80 Negroes and 20 English servants. So there you go. I mean, that was it right there. The owning class, the people who own everything, they've known since back then, hundreds of years ago, that the real danger to their power is normal folks all joining together and kicking them out. And billionaires today have the same fear and anxiety. And racism was developed as a strategy to keep that from happening. Right here, we're talking about in the 1700s, white servants and black slaves were on the same level, and they had to cultivate a difference, because the people living at that time, they just saw each other as human beings, and they were like, hey, we're all getting screwed by this current system, so we should join together to combat that. And so that's the real fear, and that's how racism is still used to this day, to keep black folks and white folks from joining together against the billionaires.
It's funny too, because I think people need to also realize that's the first time that the word white actually surfaced.
Yes.
There was no such thing as white. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and how that changed the complete narrative of how people began to look at each other? And more importantly, women need to understand this too, because it put them in a servitude situation all the way up until, I would say, don't get me up with the dates, I would say probably until women's rights came to be.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years of patriarchy.
Yeah.
Patriarchy is men over women. And that goes back almost as far as agriculture, which could be about 10 or 13,000 years. So, but both cases, racism and patriarchy, are what are known as hierarchies, where you have one over another. So there's, it's men over women under patriarchy, and under American racism, it's white folks over black folks. The hierarchy is saying that one has more value than the other, that men have more value than women, and it's dehumanizing. It's a way of saying that this person doesn't have as much value as this person. And when you have a situation like that, it makes it easier to start oppressing the one that's supposed to be below the other one. And that's the basis of how racism was developed in this country, because the owning class, they were terrified that all these white servants and all these black slaves would see each other as equals and join up together. So they had to create a hierarchy. They had to create a hierarchy that said that white servants had more status and more value than black slaves. And that is the basis for how racism came about. And one of the ways they did that was by passing laws. I've got another example here of some laws that were passed. In 1661, a law was passed in Virginia that in case any English servant shall run away in the company of any Negroes, he would have to give special service for extra years to the master of the runaway Negro. In 1691, Virginia provided for the banishment of any white man or woman being free who shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free. So they were putting in punishments, as well as there was also rewards. So when an indentured white servant would finish their service, they would be given, because that would usually be for a certain number of years. So like a person would sell themselves as an indentured servant for like a certain number of years or time. So like after the 10 years was up, it was traditional for the person who had bought the indentured servant's time to pay off that servant with maybe some land or some gold or some kind of something to set them up on moving on their own terms. And of course, with the slave class, there was none of that. They were just treated as objects, and they were completely dehumanized, and there was none of that, so that was part of the way that they were building that system, by saying when a white servant finishes their time, a concept that did not exist for the black slaves, that they would be rewarded with these material possessions. And that helped create a class status of, these former indentured servants now had means to go live on their own, which was not something that existed at all for the slave class. So it was choices like this where things were put into place to create this status, create this hierarchy. And once that was in place, that made it easier for the former white indentured servants to look down on the black slaves, as they had more status now and they had more possessions or whatever.
And I think too that people need to realize that, I believe part of that book also may or may not highlight the fact that you was not even considered a American in this newfound land if you was of color,
right?
Even if you was born on this land. Right. What kills me about this, the more I think about it, is how can people write a law in place and enforce it and not be challenged? Like, who really set up the industry to say, this is how we're going to do it? Let me go here. This is how we're going to play the game of life.
Right.
Like, who put these individuals in charge to say, we're the power, like our founding forefathers. What gave
Yeah.
you the right to say the right to freedom, the pursuit of happiness, but you own 200 slaves, you impregnate slaves, you rendered out punishment, but at the same time, you write a constitution that says all men are created equal, but there's a clause in there. If you are a Negro, you're less than 1% human. Like, who
Yeah, well,
thinks
yeah.
this?
I think you're referring to the 3/5 compromise, where
Right.
where slaves were considered 3/5 of a white person for for counting how many people, how many representatives should be in an area, and it back during that period. The black population vastly outnumbered the white population in some southern states. It was like
Right.
7-3. It was like there were huge population, and that's one of the reasons that the slave owners wanted that compromise, because they wanted to have more power, and that was a way of increasing their power by saying, well, they're not worth as much as the white population, but they're worth this much so that we can at least count them. But you're right. Like, we go back to that, to our founding fathers. There was one founding father, John Jay. He was our first Supreme Court Chief Justice. And he said that the people who own the country should run the country. And that was a guiding principle back then that carries through even to today. And the people who made those decisions were largely the owning class. This isn't something that gets talked about a lot, but George Washington owned more land than any other person in the country when they were writing the Constitution. So that made him the richest man in the country. He was the Jeff Bezos of his day, the Elon Musk of his day. And that was the class of people who could afford to take 5 months? I think it was 5 months to write the Constitution in the summer of 1787. Go to Philadelphia from May to September and write the Constitution. Like, you couldn't do that if you were a laborer, if you had a job. Like, if you weren't independently wealthy, like James Madison, who is what we would call a Nepo baby today, someone who had a really, really rich father. And that's how he was able to spend as much time as he did, talking about writing the Constitution and being a founding father. Those people only had that much time because they were the wealthiest people in the country, and they could afford to take 4 or 5 months off, go to Philadelphia and write all the rules in their own benefit, including really, like, the 3/5 compromise is one of the most shameful aspects of of American history, honestly. And it's right there in the Constitution. It doesn't apply anymore, but it's still a disgusting, shameful part of our history.
And it's so funny because our founding forefathers done a lot of crooked ass shit to self-serve themselves. And you're right.
Absolutely.
George Washington was buying land during the time of the American Revolutionary War. And then you got people like Benjamin Franklin that was almost a spy, where he's looking out for his best interests and going back overseas, negotiating stuff for himself. So let's go here. I still can't grasp my thinking around how other cultures, blacks, Native Americans, Orientals, didn't have a say so. Did how much power did England have? The crown, let's call it what it is. How much power did the crown actually have to put this in play? Because to me, it sounds like the crown would have had to have some political figures, is what we might call them, in place to really make this happen. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And it wasn't the crown. We shouldn't blame the crown. We should blame the people who were the landholders. Now, the crown did make some of those landholders. Like, we look at Pennsylvania. The entire state of Pennsylvania was a territory given as a gift to William Penn, an aristocrat from England. And so that's why it's called Pennsylvania, means Penn's Woods, because it was gifted to William Penn, one man, right? So the crown made these really powerful landholders just by giving all this land away to different people. And those landholders are the ones who had all the power during the colonial period. Honestly, they were the ones making all the decisions, and they were the ones who were like, let's develop racism. They didn't say things like that, but that was, you can see that there was a logic to it, that it was done for a reason, that it was done to preserve the power of the people who already had the most power. And they wanted to maintain that power. And so they were the ones who were in the legislatures in all the different colonies making these laws. Virginia is one example that's used several times in Zinn's book in that chapter, that they were making those laws. And one other thing to realize is that in the early days of the American Republic, not everybody had voting rights. It didn't matter if you were white or black. You only had voting rights if you had property, if you were a landholder, if you had a certain amount of wealth. Those were the only people who were allowed to vote in the early days. And it wasn't until after Andrew Jackson in the early 1800s that the franchise was extended beyond just landholders and given to mostly white men. And then it was not until the early 1900s that women were added into that franchise. And then, even though what is it? I think the 13th or 14th Amendment gave black folks the right to vote after the Civil War, gave them citizenship. Because of Jim Crow laws, most black folks couldn't vote until the 1950s and 60s when we had the Voting Rights Act. And now here we are this week. The Supreme Court struck down the Voting Rights Act, which could bring back Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow went away, but then now here's the Supreme Court saying, oh no, we kind of thought about it, and now we're going to give the opportunity for some states to start making those laws again. So that's, it's democracy is not a straight line. The history of American democracy has been very bumpy, and it's taken a while to get where we are. But that's just how it's been so far.
I tell you what's funny. You talked about all of a sudden they may or may not reactivate such things as the Jim Crow law. But I tell people, if you don't understand history and follow the breadcrumbs, they can redo everything. Even we talked about this before. Just think about it. When you hear a president's name like Abraham Lincoln, most individuals say he freed the slaves. I said, Abraham Lincoln never freed a slave. If it wasn't for the Negroes, who knows what the South might, we don't know what America would have been had it not been for that. Because remember, there was letters that was never published that Abraham Lincoln, they pretty much died with him until they just resurfaced the hidden letters of Lincoln, who clearly said, if it wasn't for the impact of the Negro soldier, who knows what America would have been. To go a little bit deeper with this, you tapped on something. It wasn't until the 60s that certain things, the right to vote, surfaced. There's such things as the Jim Crow law. The 60s, now I was born in the 60s. So now we got the 70s, we got the 80s, the 90s, and look where we're at now. And we're still dealing with unresolved issues that could resurface, could amplify the way we look at our neighbor in this country. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, I would tie it back into what we were already talking about, which is that all the division that we have in this country is mostly intentional, is mostly intentionally designed to keep the working class separated. Because something happened back in the 1930s, post Wall Street crash, when we had the Great Depression, and the owning class was kind of on their back foot. And it was a period when there was intense labor struggle, and people were joining unions. We had the highest level of union membership we ever had in American history. And that made the elites panic, the owning class panic, because they were like, shoot, the working class is starting to unify, and we can't allow that. We cannot allow that, because the working class power comes at the expense of the owning class power. It's a little bit like
A teeter
what do you
totter.
call that?
A
Yeah,
teeter.
it's like, yeah, teeter totter. It's like this one
Yeah.
goes up and this one goes down. So since that period in the 1940s, we had something. The owning class started pushing back, and they started getting organized. And in the 1970s, they really started getting organized and created something that we call culture war. And that is still very much in effect today. And it's a lot of the basis for what separates the Democrats from the Republicans is all culture war. And it's issues like abortion, and it's issues like trans rights. And it's, you can go down the list of all the hot button issues from the last 40 years. Those are all culture war battles. And the culture war exists to keep us from fighting class war, which is when the working class unifies against the owning class. The culture war exists in you can put racism and you can put patriarchy in there too. Those things exist to separate us, to separate men from women, to separate white folks from black folks, to keep us all, to separate liberal from conservative, to keep people fighting, to keep people. And look at how social media operates mostly on rage. It's like the stuff that gets the most attention on our social media is the stuff that makes people angry and gets them all wound up and yelling at each other.
Yeah.
And that's culture war. That's that's us fighting amongst ourselves. There was a tactic back during the 30s and 40s, or even further back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, where a factory would start getting some class consciousness, and the workers would start unifying, and they might start forming unions, and then the factory owner would intentionally ship in people who spoke a different language from a different area and start filling the factory with, like, let's say it's south side of Chicago.
Right.
And the workers are mostly Polish.
Right.
And then they would start unionizing. And here the factory owner would say, okay, let's start shipping in Irish people or Italian people. And they would speak a different language, have a different culture, and they wouldn't get along with the Polish people. And suddenly, everybody's more focused on all the differences between the Poles and the Irish or the Italians, and they're fighting each other, and they're not fighting the owner anymore. And that is the basic strategy that we're talking about here that goes all the way back to the earliest days of this country.
It's so funny you said that. I worked at Daimler Chrysler in Twinsburg, Ohio, and I never will forget this. I was the fitness director, and I think maybe my second or about 30 days into the job, they went on a strike. I drive back to Indianapolis to run my gym. That's a 5-hour drive. As soon as I get to the Indianapolis border, the union people call me and say, you got to come back to work. And I say, what the fuck? So I drive back to Twinsburg. That's 10 hours now that I don't been on the road. And the next thing I knew, what you just said happened. A company decided to come in. I won't mention the company's name, and decided to take over. So just roll down this rabbit hole with me, listeners. Now, you got people that's been working at this plant for years. And just like you said, they have the whites, the blacks. I see these people coming to work every day. All of a sudden, the fear factor sets in. A company is about ready to take you out. Well, the first thing they do is do what? They go to the union rep. Well, union protector, I said, hold down, dude. Union can't help you with your job. And they go, why? I said, because first of all, you're getting ready to get bought out. So this is what they're gonna do to you. They're gonna bring in some workers. Let's call them scam workers, like they did it. Remember the NFL, the scam players?
Scabs, yeah.
Let's bring them in because they're gonna work for half the price because they need a job. And it's going to either scare you, because what they was trying to do is get them to take all early buyouts so the company can bring in other workers to keep the company afloat enough to transition the company out of the Ohio area and move it overseas. And I'd be damned if it didn't work, because they used my office as a way to negotiate the contracts where everybody bought out. But this is where I'm going with this too. I asked some of the people, I was like, how long you been working here? And someone was making like $30, $40 an hour, and they're panicking. I'm like, well, what did you do with your money? And they all got quiet. And I'm thinking to myself, when these things happen, because clearly it's part of the game. You know what I mean? What we just said is part of the game. But what responsibilities do we need to take when these games begin to happen? Or are we just so naive about history repeating itself that we naturally become part of the game and get basically screwed over in the process? What's your take?
Well, something that occurred to me when you were telling that story is another way that that we're divided is, you have union workers who have better salaries because their union has helped negotiate that over the years. And so they're higher paid, but then you have you have people who have low pay who don't, and who look at those union members and feel resentful about them having higher pay. And this is another way that we're played off against each other. This is why you think about homelessness. You think about, it's beneficial for the owning class to have people who are homeless living out on the street, because they are like a living reminder, a living warning to any working person that you could end up there. Right.
Wow.
And so there's no incentive from the owning class to actually end homelessness, because those people are helping scare the workers into accepting less. Because if you don't agree with the owners when they try to slash your wages or your hours or whatever, that you could end up out on the street. You could end up living in your car, right? And so this is another way that we're played off against each other, and it's helpful for there to be a super low minimum wage. $7.25 is the federal minimum wage. It's gone up, I think $1 in the last 40 years, right? Something like it's nobody could live on $7.25 an hour in this day and age. Nobody. And that's why it's never been raised, is because if they keep it artificially low, if they suppress it, then people aren't making enough to get by. And it's easier to keep wages low if the bottom is kept very low. And you'll hear people, wealthy people, even advocate for no minimum wage and say, oh, there shouldn't be any minimum wage. So that means the floor goes down to zero. So it's legal to pay people just $2 an hour, which is something that restaurant workers still get, these insane low wages, below minimum wage, below $7.25, because that's just because they're supposed to get tips. But like, it's crazy. Like, so this is all these rules are made by the people who have economic power, and part of that they use that economic power to have political power. And they're helped by a system in this country. We have a money-driven political system. The only way to get elected is to have giant piles of money. So, money runs our political system, and people with money make all the decisions in our political system about what the minimum wage is, and about how worker protections and who can join a union and how to join a union. there was a law back in the late 40s that was passed, Taft-Hartley, that outlawed all of the most effective strategies that the labor movement had been using during the 20s and 30s and 40s. And so they said, sit down strikes, illegal. Sympathy strikes, illegal. They outlawed all these effective tactics that labor had in order to suppress labor and suppress wages.
That's crazy. Let's go back and talk about this part. People would be listening to this, and naturally, you are Caucasian. They would be like, "Why are you so concerned about other races when you should be privileged that you're classified the way that you've been classified?" What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, I can't deny my own privilege. I grew up and my dad had some money back in the 80s. And I went to a really good college, the University of Michigan, and I was lucky to have those advantages. I went to private school, Catholic school, when I was a kid. And my parents paid a lot of money for that tuition and everything. But the fact is, we are divided intentionally. And that makes me mad. Because I see all this, and I'll say another thing. I have family from the South, and I was exposed to racist attitudes as a kid, and I grew up, and I had to break out of those racist attitudes.
What do you mean by that? That you was exposed to
that
racial attitudes?
Yeah, that people in my family would use the N-word, and I would hear that as a kid growing up, and and that was, to me, when you're a kid, you don't know any better. You just think that's just how the way the world is. But I would say that learning about history and learning about how intentional racism is in order to keep us divided and keep us separated, because in my view, the view I've developed over time as I was able to leave that, those racist attitudes behind and move past them, is that there aren't multiple races on this earth. There aren't really, the whole idea of race is an artificial construct, that we're all human beings, and there's only one race, the human race. And we should care about our fellow humans, and that every human life has value. It doesn't matter what your melanin content is in your skin, right? And where your ancestors grew up and what latitude on the planet, right? If you grew up in your ancestors grew up in a northern climate versus a southern climate, there's no difference between, ultimately we all have the same biology. And, there are some exceptional people who are born with genetic gifts. But it doesn't matter if you're white or black. Like Michael Jordan had incredible genetic gifts, and Albert Einstein had incredible genetic gifts, and we're just different people get different genetic gifts. And we, but all these ideas we have about race and about hierarchy, about one group having more value than others, that's all learned. That's all learned behavior. Those are all learned attitudes. And they haven't existed forever. And that's one of the most important things I learned, is that these attitudes haven't existed forever. And that's why reading stuff like Howard Zinn's book and learning how those attitudes were created and put foisted on us all from the top down, from people who had a lot of money and wealth. They helped foster those attitudes with laws that they passed and incentives that they built. And it's really gross. And it makes me, just stepping outside of the white black dynamic in this country and look over to Israel, and how there's a hierarchy happening there too, that says that Israelis are worth more than Palestinians. And because Israelis are worth more than Palestinians, because of this racial hierarchy, it's okay to kill Palestinians wholesale, right? Like, that's wrong. It's just, we all agree that genocide is wrong. Genocide is one of the worst crimes that humanity has on earth. right? To just
Mhm.
wipe out a people because of their heritage, right?
Right.
Like it's crazy. And I reject that. I reject that Israelis have more value than Palestinians. And I
Mm.
reject that white people have more value than black people, or that men have more value than women.
What do you before we wrap up, Scott, first of all, let me say thank you for taking your time out of your busy day to come and bless me by coming back on the show and
Oh,
spreading knowledge.
Andre, I love coming on your show. I love talking to you. I really enjoy our conversations. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Oh, we're not done. I got to go here with you.
Okay. 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 Okay.
I got to go here with you, because I love history. I love learning more about who we are as individuals, as humans, not classification as humans. But I'm going to go here with this. Where did we go wrong? Let's start this point from the Reconstruction of America. Everybody, our founding forefathers and people who came over here to this new country had a vision. But what do you think we went wrong in the vision? Do you think that we had too much white colonialism versus culture colonialism? Like, where did we go wrong in the Reconstruction of America?
Well, I wouldn't lay the blame at the feet of normal people like you and me. It's not
Okay.
our fault. Um, I would say that settler colonialism is a vile practice, because settler colonialism is based on moving in and taking land and property from another person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened when the European settlers came in and started pushing west with Manifest Destiny and all that. And just they were pretending like the Native Americans didn't even exist.
Right.
Those were human beings also, and they were wiped out wholesale. The idea that we would American European settlers would slaughter buffalo as an intentional strategy to starve Native Americans of their primary food source. It's vile. That's a type of genocide as well. Is another way that genocide was enacted, and it's totally vile. Coming in and taking from others in that way, that was the vision of how this country was created. And so I would say that, that right there is that's part of where we went wrong. But I don't think we should say we. And I think that we can recognize that was wrong and move past it. We don't have to maintain that settler colonial attitude, because that attitude is based in hierarchy, just like we've been talking about, where white European settlers were more valuable than Native Americans. So that made it okay to kill Native Americans. And that's awful. That's terrible. But that was the implied attitude that was just accepted, and that is continues to this day. It's those hierarchies. Hierarchy is the original sin that says that some have more value than others. And one of the ways that, even when we talk about the owning class, supposedly a person with wealth has more value than a person without wealth because they have all this wealth. And the wealthy class, the people who have lots of wealth, the Rockefellers, all these wealthy families, Jeff Bezos, they aren't actually superior to us in any way. They have lots more money, but they're not better human beings than us. They haven't figured anything out to
Right.
become immortal or
Right.
anything like
Right.
that. So, when I think about how do we get out of this,
Right.
I think it's about starting to see the value that other human beings possess just by virtue of being human beings.
Mhm.
And part of that is in our biological programming. And one thing I like to do that helped me move past my own racist programming is start appreciating the beauty and innocence of children of other races. When I know I said that other races don't exist, but I'm just, we have an understanding, right? So
Right.
if I could look at a beautiful African American child or a beautiful Chinese child
Right.
or from India or from Palestine and see the beauty of this little baby and
Right.
think about how we all start that way. And this baby doesn't have any prejudice,
Right.
right? You're not born with prejudice. You're not born with those attitudes. Those attitudes are learned. And the way to move past it is to start loving one another's babies,
Right.
and look at that baby and imagine I could take that baby and raise that baby if I had to. Like, I could love this baby. I could love this baby as my own. I have an adopted child myself.
Mhm.
And I come from a family that's done that. My sister's adopted. My wife is adopted.
Mhm.
So I'm a big proponent of that kind of attitude of adopting another person and saying, you're part of my family now, and I love you just the same as if you were born into this family.
Right.
And that's the attitude that extends.
Right.
Because if you can look at a baby and say, I could love this baby, you can look at a teenager and say, I could love that teenager. And then you
Right.
can look at an adult and say, I could love that adult, and
Right.
say, this is a human being and they have value.
Right. So I guess what you're saying in a nutshell, in order to change the mistake that we made during the Reconstruction, is we lost that sense of value with other people, is what it boiled
Yeah.
down to be. And resources became the top. Resources and self-preservation became the meat all. But if you go back to where we started this topic, Baker's Rebellion started with everybody getting along, and because they got along, it put fear into the mindsets of the elite that controlled the power setting. So, in closing, what we need to do is go back to that mindset that they had in that book, Baker's Rebellion, the history of Baker's Rebellion, and realize that, just like you just said, Scott, we all have a common goal, and that's to respect each other and understand that we are human and not black, white, Japanese, all this. We all can survive if we work together as a team. What's your take?
Absolutely. And seeing the ways that we are oppressed together, seeing the ways that we are kept powerless by our system because it's a money driven system, because the owning class has so much power. The way that we gain strength is by embracing one another as equals and saying, we all collectively, we have a lot more power. I think there's about 800, 900 billionaires on Earth, and there's 8.2 billion people on Earth. So if it's 8.2 billion versus 900, we have a gigantic advantage in
Yeah.
numbers.
Yeah.
And if we can start to see each other as allies instead
Right.
of looking down on each other through some fake racial hierarchy or patriarchy, and start seeing one another as allies who can work together, who have the same problems, maybe not at the same level. Everybody's got their own problems, of course, but we share a lot of the same problems, especially if you're a person who lives paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
That means you're in the working class. And all the people who live paycheck to paycheck have a lot more in common with one another than we do with Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, the people who own everything. And there's no reason that those people should own everything.
Scott, thank you so much. How can the viewers reach out to you, follow you on social media, and get much, much more educational tidbits from you?
I would love it if people would come to my Substack, letsmakethempay.substack.com, or look me up on TikTok, Let's Make Them Pay. You can also find me under Scott Bennett there. I'm on Instagram and YouTube as well. Come find my stuff on my Substack. I've been putting out about one post a week lately. I would love to do more, but I'm feeling the pressure of my own full-time job. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Thank you so much, Scott, for coming on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you subscribe share, like, follow, do whatever it takes. Click that button. All it takes is one click to make a difference in your life or change somebody else's. This has been another, and I do mean another, exciting episode of Andre the Beast Creighton Show.